Stop everything you are doing right now and listen very closely, because beneath the glossy magazine covers, the emotional Netflix documentaries, and the carefully orchestrated public relations machinery of the royal diaspora, a massive financial wall is beginning to fracture. Somewhere inside a highly secure government archive in British Columbia, Canada, there sits an official contract signed in March 2023 that binds the public taxpayers to a staggering 15 million Canadian dollars to fund Prince Harry's premier legacy project, the Invictus Games. On paper, it is celebrated as a noble endeavor to uplift wounded, sick, and injured service members who sacrificed their bodies for global security. However, within the dark labyrinth of modern philanthropy, things are rarely as pure as the press releases claim. When independent investigators formally requested the line-by-line itemization of how this massive public treasure was actually being utilized under Appendix A of that identical contract, they did not receive clarity. Instead, they were hit with a solid, impenetrable wall of redacted ink. Every single dollar amount, every projection, and every single specific expense had been completely blacked out by a government protecting a royal entity from public scrutiny. This is not how an open, transparent charity behaves when it has nothing to conceal. This is the precise survival behavior of a sophisticated corporate enterprise that has realized an outsider has finally managed to pull the master thread of its hidden financial ledger. The unraveling of this massive mythology did not begin with a mainstream media house or a compromised royal correspondent sitting in a London newsroom. It began because a highly credentialed commercial airline pilot in the United States, who previously worked as a professional in high-level medical finance, decided to perform a basic mathematical cross-reference that the entire institutional press corps deliberately avoided for over a decade. Her name is Rachel Maxwell, and together with seasoned American investigative journalist Paula Froelich, she began downloading public filings across multiple international jurisdictions. They aligned the United Kingdom Charity Commission records next to Canadian provincial grant allocations and United States Department of Defense military sporting budgets. What the hard math revealed was an existential shock to the system. When you look closely at the Vancouver Whistler edition of the Invictus Games, the total closed budget reached an astronomical 63.2 million Canadian dollars for just 543 competing veterans. If you divide those two numbers, you arrive at a staggering reality, which is that it cost approximately $118,000 for every single individual wounded soldier who walked through those stadium gates. Think about that number very carefully. $118,000 per veteran. As Rachel Maxwell brilliantly pointed out to her global audience, that is life-changing, transformative wealth. If that capital had been handed directly to those wounded heroes, they could have bought advanced bionic prosthetics, completely renovated their family homes to accommodate their severe service-related disabilities, or purchased specialized medical transport vehicles to reclaim their physical independence. Instead, that immense wealth was swallowed entirely by an elite administrative apparatus, luxurious staging, and international travel logistics. To truly understand how inflated and bloated this operation has become, we must contrast it directly against the institutional benchmarks that inspired it in the first place. Back in 2013, Prince Harry visited the United States Department of Defense Warrior Games in Colorado Springs. He was genuinely moved by the incredible spirit of the wounded American troops, and he returned to London with the explicit ambition to expand that beautiful domestic concept into a grand international stage, which became the Invictus Games. The American Warrior Games is the direct institutional parent of Invictus. Yet, the United States military continues to run its annual Warrior Games on a total estimated budget of between $2 million and $10 million depending on the year. Even at its most expensive ceiling, the American program costs a tiny fraction of what Prince Harry's organization spends on a single edition. Furthermore, Germany operates its own highly successful adaptive military sporting events for an astonishingly modest $200,000 per event. That means the entire German national veteran sporting manifestation costs less than the administrative expenditure of just two individual competitors at Harry's Canadian event. Even more damning is the historical trajectory of Invictus itself. When Prince Harry launched the inaugural Games in London back in 2014, it featured 300 competitors from 13 different nations, and it operated on a modest budget of a few £100,000. Fast forward 12 years, and the upcoming Birmingham edition is projected to cost upwards of £60 million. The core mission has not altered, the number of athletes has not grown by a factor of 100, and yet the financial demand has accelerated to a level that defies conventional non-profit accounting. Where is that extra money actually going? The answer begins to emerge when you look at the highly controversial book published by legendary investigative author Tom Bauer. With a formidable legal team behind him, Bauer made explicit, written allegations that substantial sums of Invictus charitable funds have been systematically directed toward financing private jet travel, ultra-luxury five-star hotel accommodations, and bespoke premium transportation for Harry and Meghan personally. In normal society, if an author prints such explosive, damaging accusations against a prominent international figure, they are instantly hit with massive libel lawsuits. Yet, to this day, Tom Bauer has never been successfully sued. His book remains uncorrected in global retail spaces, and the allegations sit in plain view. But the internal rot goes far deeper than luxury travel. When the Invictus Games Foundation in London finally submitted its annual accounts to the United Kingdom Charity Commission after an unprecedented and deeply alarming 2-year delay, the true structural tragedy was laid bare for the public to see. In that exact financial year, the foundation made a conscious decision to cut its direct financial grants to active veteran organizations on the ground by a staggering 63%. The absolute funding fell from over £534,000 down to a mere £200,000. While the men and women who suffered physical and psychological trauma for their nations had their grassroots support slashed by nearly 2/3, the foundation's top-line incoming revenue actually skyrocketed by 41%. Money was pouring into the top of the royal charity at historic levels, while the money flowing out to the actual human beings on the ground was aggressively restricted. Instead of supporting veterans, the excess capital was utilized to create a brand-new, 6-figure executive corporate role, inflate the cash reserves to nearly $3 million, and pay their top administrative staff members salaries that sit significantly above the standard market pay band for British charities of this size. The institutional market has already noticed these massive structural red flags, and the heavy dominoes have begun to fall in rapid, terrifying succession. Boeing, the global aerospace giant and the single loudest, most prestigious corporate sponsor in the entire royal philanthropic portfolio, has quietly walked away without making a single public statement. They did not renew their allegiance, choosing instead to execute a silent, decisive exit from Prince Harry's flagship brand. At the exact same time, inside the British governance structure, one of the most respected, highly credentialed figures in charity oversight, Melanie Poole, who served as the vice-chairman of the Board of Trustees for the upcoming Birmingham Games, abruptly resigned from her position. This is a woman whose entire career is anchored in high-level regulatory compliance and lottery-funded charity management. Her departure is the ultimate internal alarm. Journalists are openly asking if she chose to step down before the inevitable regulatory audits and financial investigations blow the doors off the foundation. Meanwhile, across the world, the federal government of Australia just delivered the most brutal geopolitical snub of all. In their latest national budget, despite injecting an additional $14 billion into their defense sector and dedicating $770 million toward preventing veteran suicide, the Australian government completely eliminated its $9 million routine funding renewal for Invictus Australia. They gave the organization's chief executive only minutes of notice before going live to the world. A sophisticated intelligence ally looked directly at the financial storm gathering around Prince Harry's entity and chose to cut the cord cleanly, silently, and permanently. This is not an isolated incident of bad luck, but rather part of a documented structural collapse that follows the royal patron wherever his administrative influence expands. Just over a year ago, Centerbale, the African children's charity that Prince Harry co-founded in 2006 to honor the profound humanitarian legacy of his late mother, Princess Diana, suffered a spectacular and deeply damaging public implosion. The chair of the board, Dr. Sophie Shandoka, publicly accused Harry and his circle of institutional bullying, causing the entire governance board to collapse, forcing Harry to step back as patron, and triggering a formal regulatory inquiry by the Charity Commission of England and Wales. The exact same cycle of rapid senior resignations, breakdown of professional relationships, intense regulatory scrutiny, and sudden corporate flight is now repeating itself inside the Invictus architecture. This is a highly sophisticated system where sovereign taxpayer money enters a foreign non-profit entity, only to be converted into a masked licensing fee that crosses the ocean into a private, discretionary British fund where public eyes can no longer trace the true origin of the dollar. The myth of the selfless humanitarian prince is dissolving under the weight of cold, hard financial data, and the insiders are already swimming toward the lifeboats before the tide completely turns. The silence from the official public relations apparatus in Montecito is not just a defensive posture. It is an active confirmation that the foundational architecture of this royal charity is structural and deliberate. When the team at News Nation, alongside the highly persistent independent analysts who broke this story, reached out to the official representatives of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle with explicit, line-by-line accounting questions, the response was a complete freeze. No emails were returned, no clarifying spreadsheets were offered, and no institutional statements were issued to defend the integrity of the ledger. Instead, a secondary defensive action was initiated on the Internet. Within exactly 3 hours of the redacted Canadian contract being made public by an independent American whistleblower, the entire Invictus Canada website was abruptly pulled offline. When the digital platform finally crawled back into the public domain, the sensitive financial documents had been completely scrubbed from the open directory. Furthermore, the web architecture had been fundamentally modified so that any regular citizen, independent academic, or curious tax-paying journalist who wished to examine the organizational finance sheets was instantly forced to log in using a tracked personal Dropbox account. This transition is highly revealing because a legitimate, transparent charity that operates on public grants wants the world to verify its integrity. It does not construct a digital surveillance checkpoint to log the identities of the specific individuals who are reading its public balance sheets unless it is desperate to monitor who is getting closer to the underlying truth. This mechanical evasion becomes increasingly dark when you dissect the unique financial pipeline that connects the Canadian taxpayers directly to the British Registered Foundation. The $63.2 million Canadian dollars earmarked for the Vancouver Whistler edition was not managed directly by the Central Board in London. Instead, it was funneled through a localized, domestic non-profit entity known as the Vancouver Whistler Games Corporation. On the Canadian side of the Atlantic, the operation appears completely standard, as domestic non-profits must file regional accounts and their direct government grants are explicitly catalogued under local treasury rules. However, the structural magic occurs through a mechanism known as a brand licensing fee. In order for the Canadian corporation to legally utilize the name, the intellectual property, and the global prestige of the Invictus brand, it must pay an undisclosed licensing fee directly back to the Central Invictus Games Foundation in the United Kingdom. When independent financial professionals utilized freedom of information laws to uncover the exact commercial value of this specific licensing arrangement, they discovered that the entire figure had been blacked out in the master government contracts. The public is legally forbidden from knowing how many millions of Canadian taxpayer dollars immediately left the sovereign borders of Canada to cross the ocean into a private, discretionary British charitable fund. Once that massive capital lands in London, it effectively undergoes an institutional transformation, shifting from strictly audited public grant money into private charity revenue that can be allocated within the incredibly broad, flexible boundaries of United Kingdom charity law on whatever the central trustees deem appropriate, including executive salary expansion, elite consultancy retainers, and high-level corporate lifestyle travel. To comprehend why this specific structure is causing veteran board members to panic and head for the nearest corporate lifeboats, one must examine the direct audit findings delivered by the auditors at Veterans Affairs Canada. Even within a theoretically balanced paper budget, the Canadian federal government was so highly concerned with the structural trajectory of the host organization's spending that they consciously implemented a standard contribution framework penalty. They formally withheld a final holdback payment of $750,000 Canadian dollars and actively recovered approximately $447,888 Canadian dollars directly from the host group's accounts. This clinical post-event recovery proves that even after the cameras were packed away and the grand closing ceremonies concluded, there was a substantial volume of public funds that the host organization could not legitimately justify spending under standard public accounting rules, forcing a sovereign state to quietly claw its treasure back. When you lay these fragments down side by side in a single frame, the picture shifts from an innocent narrative of organizational growing pains into a highly calculated, structural architecture designed specifically to minimize public accountability while maximizing the elite, centralized control of massive capital flows. The average citizen is consistently told to focus entirely on the beautiful, tear-jerking human interest stories of the adaptive athletes on the track, while the sophisticated machinery in the background quietly disconnects the dollar from the soldier. This profound systemic distortion is precisely why the institutional parent program, the United States Department of Defense Warrior Games, stands as a devastating mathematical indictment against Prince Harry's operation. When the United States military creates an annual competitive landscape for its wounded heroes, it operates with severe, hyper-focused discipline, ensuring that every single dollar allocated by Congress translates directly into physical therapy, high-performance athletic prosthetics, family lodging, and genuine psychological rehabilitation on the ground. The Warrior Games do not require an international matrix of nested non-profit corporations, they do not demand multi-million-dollar brand licensing payments across international waters, and they do not finance private jet networks to transport elite non-military patrons to five-star resorts. They deliver a functionally identical, elite athletic experience for wounded troops at a microscopic fraction of the administrative cost. The contrast is not merely a matter of institutional style, It is a profound ethical divergence that reveals what happens when a noble, beautiful concept born in the military community is systematically seized by the high-gloss celebrity ecosystem of Montecito and scaled through a corporate multiple that defies traditional philanthropic morality. When an entire sovereign nation like Australia, which shares the highest level of strategic intelligence with its Western allies, reviews the underlying data of this entity and chooses to completely kill a routine $9 million renewal without public fuss, it is sending a definitive, coded message to the global financial sector that the institutional risk has officially bypassed the charitable reward. The historical echoes of this structural decay are impossible to ignore when you examine the wider pattern of Prince Harry's philanthropic history, specifically the total institutional destruction of Centibale. Founded with the beautiful, pure intention of honoring Princess Diana's historic work with vulnerable children suffering from the HIV crisis in southern Africa, Centibale was for many years the definitive proof that Harry possessed a genuine, deeply rooted humanitarian instinct that operated independently of the palace walls. Yet, the moment the governance structure was subjected to intense, centralized pressure and the traditional royal methodologies of control were applied, the entire entity imploded in full public view. When the highly respected board chair, Dr. Sophie Chandoka, formally and publicly accused the royal patron and his closest trustees of institutional bullying and severe governance manipulation, it created an existential tear in the charity's credibility. The entire administrative board collapsed. The prince was forced to execute an embarrassing public step back from his own founding organization, and the Charity Commission of England and Wales was forced to initiate a formal regulatory inquiry into the structural health of the fund. This historical precedent is critical because it shatters the public relations illusion that the current financial crisis enveloping the Invictus Games is an isolated, unpredictable anomaly. It is the exact same operational footprint repeating itself across a secondary charitable brand, characterized by the sudden, quiet flight of highly credentialed compliance professionals, immediate drops in direct grassroots funding, massive increases in elite administrative overhead, and a complete wall of silence when the independent press asks for simple mathematical clarity. The final convergence of these international indicators demonstrates that the institutional lifespan of the Invictus Games mythology is rapidly approaching its ultimate hour of regulatory reckoning. What we are witnessing across two continents is not a sequence of random administrative friction, but a synchronized ideological exit by serious, institutional actors who have independently audited the math and realized the structural foundation can no longer sustain the weight of its own internal contradictions. When an organization built entirely on the emotional capital of wounded combat veterans cuts its direct support to grassroots service groups by nearly two-thirds in the exact same economic cycle where its central revenue climbs by more than 40%, it ceases to function as a legitimate charity and instead transforms into a centralized bureaucracy that exists primarily to sustain its own corporate lifestyle. The cold data preserved inside the United Kingdom Charity Commission sheets sits as an unalterable monument to this ethical distortion. The public relations apparatus can continue to deploy high-gloss video montages, frame the Montecito founders within carefully lit humanitarian landscapes, and leverage the genuine, inspiring bravery of the adaptive athletes on the track to secure positive media headlines. However, the international financial community does not make major investment decisions based on emotional branding. They read balance sheets, they analyze executive compensation structures, and they track the movement of public funds through foreign subsidiaries, and what those elite metrics are saying across the global sector is that the era of blind royal credulity has officially reached its expiration date. The silent departure of Boeing stands as the definitive institutional warning shot across the bow of the entire royal diaspora. Global aerospace conglomerates do not walk away from massive, highly publicized international charity events unless their internal compliance officers and legal teams have determined that the reputational liability of being associated with that brand significantly outweighs the corporate marketing benefit. Boeing's exit was not accompanied by a standard, polite joint press release or a soft transition statement. It was a cold, absolute severance that left the central organizers in London scrambling to secure alternative financing ahead of the highly complex Birmingham Games. This corporate flight is compounded by the structural vacancies currently plaguing the Foundation's executive levels. Senior operational positions that would historically attract an absolute flood of elite, mission-driven global professionals remain unfulfilled, empty, and silent. Competent, high-level non-profit managers are looking directly at the escalating investigative pressure, the targeted freedom of information requests filed by meticulous airline pilots, and the explosive written allegations of Tom Bauer regarding the diversion of funds for luxury travel. And they are making a conscious professional choice to preserve their personal careers rather than stepping onto a sinking administrative vessel. The quiet resignation of Melanie Poole from the Birmingham Board of Trustees is the absolute internal validation of this hidden panic. When a regulatory veteran of her immense stature, whose entire professional identity is anchored in the clinical oversight of lottery-funded charity compliance, chooses to step down without fanfare, she is not merely leaving a position. She is actively heading for the lifeboats before the inevitable state audits begin to dissect the internal ledger. This defensive retreat by highly experienced insiders provides the critical context necessary to understand the surgical budget decision executed by the Albanese government in Canberra. The Australian federal government possesses access to the unified intelligence and economic data streams of the Five Eyes Alliance, meaning their Treasury officials and policy strategists do not execute massive funding cuts based on speculative tabloid rumors. They analyzed the structural architecture of Invictus, tracked the systematic extraction of public funds through blacked-out brand licensing fees, and reviewed the internal governance implosions that previously obliterated Centervale. Armed with that comprehensive institutional knowledge, they chose to completely eliminate a routine $9 million funding renewal in a national budget that was simultaneously praised as one of the most generous defense and veteran support budgets in modern Australian history. By explicitly redirecting hundreds of millions of dollars toward localized, grassroots veteran suicide prevention programs while leaving the high-gloss Invictus brand completely stranded with minutes of warning, the Australian state delivered a masterclass in geopolitical signaling. They demonstrated to the global community that it is entirely possible to fiercely support the sacred welfare of wounded service members while entirely rejecting the bloated, celebrity-driven administrative machinery of the California diaspora. It was a clean, clinical severing of ties that shatters the central illusion that Prince Harry's project is an untouchable, globally protected sovereign endeavor. The structural mechanism discovered by Rachel Maxwell, where public taxpayer money from sovereign Western nations enters a localized non-profit games corporation only to be converted into a completely redacted licensing fee that vanishes across the Atlantic into a private British account, is the precise architectural feature that will ultimately bring the system down. It is a one-way accounting valve designed to insulate the central royal operators from direct public accountability. Under this setup, Canadian or British Columbian Treasury officials can legally claim that their local grants were spent on regional stadium preparation, while the Central Foundation in London can simultaneously claim that its British expenses are entirely compliant with domestic charity laws. The only entity that suffers under this sophisticated fragmentation is the truth. Without a fully unredacted, transparent release of Appendix A and the master brand licensing agreements, the global public is left with a profound, deeply uncomfortable mathematical reality. An organization that spends over $118,000 per individual veteran competitor while slashing direct grants to localized service groups. This is the ultimate tipping point where the mythology of the selfless, humanitarian prince can no longer survive the clinical gravity of the data. Every great institution that operates on public trust eventually faces its moment of absolute accounting, and as the investigative threads continue to be pulled by a generation of independent, uncompromised journalists, the walls enclosing the Montecito ledger are closing in slow motion. The next phase of this unfolding financial exposure will not be fought in the arena of public relations or glossy magazine covers. It will be dictated by the cold, unyielding mechanics of international charity regulation, and when that final ledger is read to the world, the early whistleblowers will be remembered as